Oh, the promise and the oath you swore have been painted red over my door.
Welcome to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast, where we explore the gospel that Jesus' earliest disciples heard and what the last several decades of historical studies have clarified about this first century Jewish message.
Listeners, welcome back to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. I'm Josh Hawkins, and I'm here with Bill Schofield and with John Harrigan. Hey, guys.
Hey, man.
Hey, buddy.
Listeners, it's great to have you as always, and we are excited about our episode today. We have finished the prophets and the Nevi'im, and now we are about to jump into the writings, into the Ketuvim. And so, as you know, this whole season, season 3, we've been looking at the Tanakh, how the Tanakh specifically was later read by the apocalyptic writers and the authors of the New Testament. And really, in our intro episode on the Tanakh at the beginning of this season, we made the case that Jewish apocalyptic and the apocalyptic thought that's developed throughout Second Temple literature and in the New Testament is the most reasonable deduction of the Tanakh, the most hermeneutically sound idea that you get coming from the Tanakh. And one of the other premises we set forth was that if you feel disadvantaged that you only have the Tanakh, then we're probably not reading it looking at it in the way like the apocalyptic writers and the authors of the New Testament did. And so these ideas were the basis for what we developed in the Torah and the Nevi'im. And some of the big themes that we set forth from the beginning was creation and covenant and divine sovereignty and judgment. And so in our last chunk of episodes on the prophets, on the Nevi'im, we saw how the writers of Jewish apocalyptic literature and the authors of the New Testament draw on so many of these big themes. And then these ideas from the prophets, they get pushed to their ultimate end in apocalyptic literature and in the New Testament, really the playing out of history in terms of God's sovereignty over his creation, the certainty of his covenantal promises coming to pass, and the fact that there will be judgment for the wicked on that day. And so we saw how so many of these ideas from apocalyptic eschatology are not novel. They're developing out of the Tanakh. So we want to begin the Ketuvim today, which is the writings, the third section of the Tanakh, T-N-K, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, right? And we want to introduce wisdom literature today, and we want to talk about the Psalms, the Proverbs, and Job in particular. But just as a general introduction, guys, let's get into this a little bit. What is wisdom literature? What's the wisdom tradition?
Yeah, wisdom tradition, so might think of Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, or like the wisdom of Ben Sira, the wisdom of Solomon. These are all generally known to be like the books associated with the Bible, like the Hebrew Bible, or with the pseudepigrapha, that are classified as wisdom tradition. Of course, there's a whole bunch of them that. There's a whole bunch of wisdom writings that are not in either the Hebrew Bible or the pseudepigrapha, or I'm sorry, not the pseudepigrapha, I meant the apocrypha, and that are pseudepigraphic, and that's a little bit of a different genre. We're touching today specifically on some of the biblical books.
Yeah, for sure. So with all of those books, I mean, do we see common elements between them? Are there, I mean, you could say, okay, maybe the Psalms or authors are writing about things going on in Israel, or David's writing about his kingship or his trust in the Lord. But then you get Solomon, who just has all sorts of stuff to say about cool things in life and what the wisdom the Lord had given him, or Ecclesiastes, it's all meaningless, right? So what are the common elements between all of these books in the wisdom literature?
Yeah, I think the main common element is divine sovereignty and how that plays out in the human condition, in life, and the covenant and God's faithfulness to Israel, that he'll bring it to completion, that he will deal with the wicked, that he'll deal with the righteous, his justice, So all of these themes kind of revolve around God's sovereignty over creation.
And I think it's important to note that when we say sovereignty, we're not saying sovereignty like the Reformed world would say sovereignty, as in like predestination, or maybe more academically said, causation. And we're just talking about sovereignty in terms of what the word actually means in terms of, its root, that to be sovereign over something simply means that God is the ruler over the heavens and the earth, that he has governance over the heavens and the earth. So when we talk about divine sovereignty, that's what we're talking about, not causation, not predestination, not in terms of how the later Reformed tradition would talk about that word.
Right.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Josh. And that's really going to be because without that understanding, you don't really understand wisdom tradition.
Right.
Wisdom is essentially framing the appropriate human response to divine sovereignty.
Yeah.
Not to divine causation, but to the fact that God is ruling the universe as he wills. And so the response to divine sovereignty, the fear of the Lord and repentance, is essentially what makes up wisdom literature in the Jewish tradition. And it's communicated in a variety of different, formats. Proverbs and Psalms are a little bit different. Job is very different than the both of them. But you have a response to divine sovereignty, and you also have it portrayed as a divine. So that's a lot of times when it's personified, more like in Job. You have a response to personal divine sovereignty, a personal encounter with divine sovereignty, like in the story of Job, which may very well be a parable of something else. But what you have a lot in the Psalms is you have a response to divine covenant faithfulness or covenant maintenance. And so you're recognizing the sovereignty of God, not just how it plays out in the individual, but how it plays out in covenant history in terms of the nation of Israel.
Yeah, and it also plays out in kind of the issues of theodicy and how can, good God allow evil in the world and the suffering of the righteous and the prosperity of the wicked,
right.
and the conflict between the righteous and the wicked, and plays out in different ways. Psalms of lament in the Psalms, the conflict between Job and his friends, the kind of proverbial wisdom in the Proverbs about the different paths of life between the righteous and the wicked.
Right.
And so all of that revolves around the response, the human response, whether righteous or wicked, to divine sovereignty and the questions that kind of swirl around that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good, guys. So we see common elements in the wisdom tradition, divine sovereignty, the framing of the appropriate human response to divine sovereignty, and then God rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked. But what does wisdom literature in general have to do with apocalyptic? I mean, compared to the prophets, for sure, there's a ton of eschatology in the prophets, but there's not a ton of eschatology in the wisdom literature. Like, you can't go to the Proverbs and read the Proverbs and he's not talking about, the day of the Lord, right? So what's the connect? What's the connect between wisdom literature and apocalyptic?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the glaring disconnect. Historically, there's not much eschatology in the wisdom literature. And eschatology is the defining feature of apocalyptic literature. So for that reason, the last 100 years of historical studies on apocalyptic literature and Second Temple writings has really made the connect between the prophetic tradition and the apocalyptic tradition. And so that kind of changed. It hasn't changed a lot. It's because it's true. But a guy named Gerhard von Rad, who was a German Old Testament scholar, taught at University of Heidelberg in his Old Testament theology that was published in 1960. He was the first to argue that wisdom was actually the mother of apocalyptic. That was his I think Kazman borrowed that phraseology later and said that apocalyptic was the mother of Christian theology. I'm pretty sure he got that from Von Rad, who argued that the wisdom tradition was the mother of apocalyptic. That kind of saying, whatever. But his argument is that the wisdom tradition was the primary driver for the development of the apocalyptic tradition rather than the prophetic tradition. And he based this primarily on the fact that the apocalyptic writers and seers were described as wise men and scribes, like in Daniel 2. And that you have in the wisdom literature, Ben Sirach and the wisdom of Solomon, you have these surveys of redemptive history after kind of the Proverbs like telling of different wisdom, and that he argued that the redemptive history, kind of the big picture of redemptive history that is how apocalyptic tends, is viewed as knowledge, as wisdom in and of itself, and that the wisdom tradition took the wrangling around divine sovereignty and the righteous and the wicked and redemptive history and looked at it big picture and kind of was the driver for that big picture approach to answer the issue between the theodicy and the righteous and the wicked. He was not received well. He hasn't been received well because, Von Rad's problem was that he wanted to pit wisdom against prophetic and argued that prophetic was not the driver of apocalyptic. And so it's just clearly not the case. So he has not been received well over the decades. Probably his chief critic would be John Collins. Collins is very clear in his criticism, which is true. But the whole point is that Von Rad really opened up the connection between the wisdom tradition and apocalyptic, whereas before it was just the prophetic tradition that was viewed as what informed and grew into the apocalyptic tradition, when in reality the whole Tanakh and both the prophetic, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim played together in the development of apocalyptic thought. And that's really, I think, the takeaway and the connect between the wisdom tradition and apocalyptic, even though there's not that much eschatology in the wisdom tradition in the biblical texts.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. And Collins, it reminds me of Collins and another big voice in that movement of trying to consider the development of apocalyptic, Paul Hansen. Paul Hansen actually said he did think the Psalms were old enough that they could have actually had a lot to do with the origin of apocalyptic, but then dismissed the rest of Von Rad. But Collins actually said something in his response in the apocalyptic imagination that I think is really helpful as we kind of look at the wisdom literature, because Collins, as John said, he really disagreed with Von Rad, yet he did concede, and this is a citation from Collins, the apocalypses do indeed present a kind of wisdom insofar as they first offer an understanding of the structure of the universe and of history, and second, they see right understanding as the precondition of right action. And so they do have this in common, that the apocalyptic literature tends to communicate history and creation and things like this. Understanding those things properly is a precondition for understanding how to respond to God. And so we do see that both in the apocalyptic literature, and that's a common thread in the wisdom literature. And so I think we're going to spend some time today talking about a little bit of interplay, because wisdom literature, as we highlighted before, really is going to highlight a lot of the questions of theodicy and the goodness of God when the righteous suffer. It's going to highlight a lot of questions of divine sovereignty, and that ultimately the questions that arise out of the wisdom literature are the same, are assumed in a lot of the apocalyptic literature. And so we're going to see, as we dive into these three books in particular, just obviously in one episode, these are going to be in a very, brief kind of a survey, but we're going to see how the seedbed of kind of the questions that are raised essentially establishes a lot of what's assumed in the apocalyptic literature.
Yeah. Well, let's get into that survey, guys. Let's start with the book of Psalms. And I think just like we've done with the prophets, we'll do a little bit of an intro and a summary of the book, of each of the books we're going to look at today, the Psalms, the Proverbs, and Job, before we get into how the apocalyptic themes in these are developed. So by way of the Psalms, first point I think that's important to note is that in our Bibles, the book of Job comes before the Psalms and the Proverbs. But in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, the Psalms is the first book in the Ketuvim. And so this is significant in the sense that it sets forth really so many foundational themes in wisdom literature. And I think when we approach the Psalms today, I think I've heard this said before, the Psalms are like comfort food to the soul, right? You think of Psalm 23 and you go, oh, the Lord is my shepherd. And, when you're having a bad day, you go to Psalm 23 and you open it up and you go, oh, he's leading me besides the quiet waters. And life is so good, right? Like this is how we have come to our modern understanding of the book of Psalms, at least here in the West and Western Christian understanding. And one of the guys that might have played into that is a name that we might have heard of before, Charles Spurgeon, right? His big, massive treasury of David, where oftentimes when we think of Charles Spurgeon, we think of a more personal application of the Psalms to the life of a believer. And we go, oh man, well, David had leadership skills and the Lord now is giving me leadership skills. And now here's how I should steward my leadership skills or whatever. I mean, all of those things. And not to say that that's wrong or sinful or evil, but that's not how the apocalyptic writers and the New Testament read the Psalms. So generally, if we're looking at just how the Psalms are organized into 5 different books with a ton of messianic and eschatological assumptions. Oftentimes in the past, the Psalms have been organized into praise psalms or Hallel psalms or lament psalms. Clearly, there are all those themes, but there's a lot more going on in the Psalms than a personal application to the life of a believer in discipleship in how we do today. And so with that said, guys, let's develop some of the apocalyptic themes from the book of Psalms.
Yeah, I mean, the book of Psalms has a lot more material, a lot more eschatological material. And as David Mitchell will argue that the redaction of the book itself is eschatologically driven, the way that the book is put together. And so the Psalms become, much more of a seedbed for apocalyptic thought later on. And you can see, the organization of the Psalms, particularly in the introduction, the first 2 Psalms, where you have Psalm 1 laying out the delineation between the righteous and the wicked and the coming divine judgment. Verse 5, therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor the sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. And verse 4, the wicked are not so, but they're like chaff that the wind drives along, and chaff becomes a metaphor that, of course, you see at the beginning of the New Testament with John the Baptist describing the coming judgment. And then chapter 2 picks up that judgment and the messianic expectation associated with the day of the Lord and coming divine judgment. The Lord is going to establish a son of David on Zion at the judgment, and the Messiah will inherit the nations, and the nations will be punished by means of the Messiah. And so you get kind of the divine sovereignty and covenant faithfulness played out in the first 2 Psalms. And then a lot, through the Psalms, you get a lot of lament around the issue of theodicy and the wicked prospering and the righteous suffering. You get a lot of praise around God and his covenant faithfulness around the coming judgment. I think particularly in the later 90s Psalms, there's a lot of that. Of course, in the Hallel Psalms and the Psalms of Ascent, there's a lot of eschatological discourse and messianic expectation tied in there. But again, I don't want to play into David Mitchell. The next couple episodes are going to be awesome.
Yeah, that's good. I also think about the structure of the Psalms, especially in terms of David's participation, which kind of defines really how the rest of the Psalms are organized. Right? The Psalms is unique because it has the titles actually as a part of a lot of the text that we have. And whereas in other books, you might find a title above a chapter, but those are really just added by translators. Whereas the titles of the Psalms, a lot of them are in a lot of the text that we have of the Psalms. And generally, it frames the majority of the Psalms as Davidic Psalms being written to the chief musician. And what's interesting about this is what it's framing the Psalm as. It's framing the Psalms not as, like Josh was saying, not as personal reflection. So we shouldn't receive it as personal reflection primarily, but also David probably wasn't thinking of it as personal reflection. Because we have in the introduction when he's thinking about that he is writing this on the occasion, like in chapter 18, when God gave him deliverance from all his enemies and from Saul. But what he writes about is not so much about him. It's actually about the nation of Israel, which makes sense, right? Because if he's actually writing this to be sung publicly in a public setting, one of the Psalms actually explains, I think it's the late 70s. I don't have it on hand here, but it explains David as someone who had left the pasture shepherding his sheep, and then God appointed him as the shepherd over the house of Israel. So making the connection between basically him being the pastor of Israel. Right, because pastor is simply a word that it's an older word for shepherd. And so a lot of the Psalms represent David shepherding Israel into the knowledge of the truth and into a right response to whether he's reflecting on his own history and how he learned about God and how to respond to God in his own history, and he's sharing that to Israel. Or you have later Psalms where the sons of Korah and or Asaph or Ethan, or there's even a psalm attributed to Moses, where they're essentially framing redemptive history in a way that helps inform how they ought to behave moving forward. And so they have entire psalms where all they're doing is rehearsing the Exodus. But the whole point is to rehearse and to be able to lay out the wisdom of moving forward and how one ought to respond to how God has acted in terms of the covenant. Another dynamic about the Psalms that's important is how they're picked up later on and how they're thought about. And I'll give a couple of examples simply from the Targums. And the Targums are helpful because, as we've used a number of times here before, by the time the Targums are written down, arguably, there's debate, probably after the time of Jesus, but they definitely reflect tradition that was around before the time of Jesus. And so, like, there'll be phrases that are common in the Psalms. Like there's a phrase in Psalm 18, which I just mentioned a second ago. My God brings me out of darkness into light. Darkness and light, that's a common theme. And so when he brings me out of darkness into light, what is he talking about? Well, in Psalm 18, he clarifies this. This is Psalm 18, verse 29 in Targum Psalms. For you light the lamp of Israel that is extinguished in the exile. So one, it's the hope of redemption from exile. So, for you are the Lord of the light of Israel. The Lord, my God, brings me out of darkness into light. he shows me the consolation of the world to come for the righteous. And so in this translation, the author of the translator of the Targums, because this is a translation, right? This is not a commentary. He thinks it's really clear that when the Lord's talking about the lamp of Israel,
Like the message?
or the Passion translation, real similar.
Or I got it. Okay. I understand now.
It's
I couldn't get the Targums.
Now
but
you get
I
it.
get it.
So they're simply saying this is what it's saying, and so they elaborate a little bit so that Targums are written in Aramaic, so that Aramaic speakers could understand and pick up the nuances.
If only the message and the passion were apocalyptic.
Yeah, then
we'd be getting somewhere.
So he shows me the consolation of the world to come for the righteous. This is essentially how they understand God bringing me out of darkness. God brings me into light as he's revealing the hope of the world to come. And then one more real quick, Psalm 27, very famous because it made it into a bunch of worship songs. I would have despaired unless I'd believed that I'd see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. So the Targum clarifies that it's that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of eternal life. In the land of eternal life. So as they're reflecting back and they're translating, these Jewish authors translating into Aramaic definitely see apocalyptic themes reverberating through the book of Psalms throughout.
Yeah.
Yeah, and later, wisdom literature that plays into apocalyptic will take, for example, like the Wisdom of Solomon, takes Psalm 1 and kind of extrapolates that. So in chapter 3, for example, it says, "But the souls of the righteous are in the hand of God. No torment will ever touch them. In the eyes of the foolish, they seem to have died. Their departure was thought to be a disaster. Their going from us to be their destruction. But they're at peace. For though in the sight of others they are punished, their hope is full of immortality. Having been disciplined a little in this age, they will receive great good because God tested them and found them worthy of himself." And then it goes on, "But the ungodly will be punished as their reasoning deserves. Those who disregarded the righteous and rebelled against God. For those who despise wisdom and instruction are miserable. Their hope is vain. Their labors are unprofitable. The works are useless. Their wives are foolish. Their children are evil. Their offspring are accursed." And then it goes on to the judgment in chapter 5 and plays out this whole interchange that happens at the judgment between the righteous and the wicked. So Psalm 1 kind of gets expanded and extrapolated, and the whole dynamic between the righteous and the wicked is kind of pushed to its ultimate end in the sovereignty of God at the divine judgment.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more that we could say about the Psalms, but we're going to reserve that for David Mitchell in our next 2 episodes. So be sure you come back, listeners. You're in for a treat. Mm-hmm. We had a great discussion with David Mitchell. Well, guys, let's move on to the Proverbs. Kind of another book here in the wisdom literature. And I think Proverbs are, like you get your little Gideon's Bible, your little, 3-inch by 2-inch Gideon's Bible, that has the New Testament and Psalms and Proverbs in it, right? So that's obviously another familiar book to many people, the Proverbs. And so just as a brief summary of the book, kind of get an introduction in the first 9 chapters, where there's benefits of wisdom and all of the important things related to getting wisdom and why wisdom literature, overall wisdom is important. And then the content of that wisdom is in all sorts of various proverbs in chapters 10 through 29. And then you kind of get a conclusion of the book in chapters 30 and 31. But all of these proverbs in so many ways are meditations on divine sovereignty and the 2 paths of response, whether you respond rightly to divine sovereignty, which is what the hope of the author of Proverbs is doing, is to say, this is the way you should respond, right? You're righteous if you respond this way, versus if you don't respond correctly to divine sovereignty, then you are wicked. And it's not good. There's bad fruit coming for you: corruption, drunkenness, conspiracy, lies, immorality, theft, oppression. Like, those are the things for people who do not walk in wisdom. But then the fruit of the righteous, of course, is integrity, uprightness, compassion, honor, truth, purity. These are the ideas that we see throughout the Proverbs that are highlighted as the appropriate or the inappropriate responses to divine sovereignty. So what about apocalyptic themes, guys? Like Proverbs, again, there isn't necessarily a lot of direct day of the Lord eschatology references in the book of Proverbs. So what do we say about apocalyptic literature, and how does that connect with the book of Proverbs?
Yeah, well, like you were saying, Josh, and like we said kind of at the intro to apocalyptic literature, what we see is really the path of wisdom is simply a life lived in light of divine sovereignty and what God has said about himself, about history, and about where history's going. And even if it wasn't explicitly understood in apocalyptic terms, many themes are there that would clearly kind of frame apocalyptic literature later on. And so let me read a section here out of chapter 1. This is just Proverbs. So this is just your Hebrew Bible, people. We don't need no Targums. We don't need no Septuagint for this one. This is just straight up Hebrew Bible. This is the NASB 95. So you guys, it'll start off and it'll become real familiar at the beginning, and then you start to listen and you go, "Oh, I didn't realize that passage went that direction." So it starts off, wisdom shouts out in the streets. She lifts her voice in the square. At the head of noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city, she utters her sayings. How long, O naive ones, will you love being simple-minded? And scoffers delight themselves in scoffing. Fools hate knowledge. Turn to my reproof, and behold, I will pour my spirit on you. I'll make my words known to you. And if you stop at verse 23, it just sounds like just like a perpetual call. Everybody should just be listening to wisdom, and just for the sake of it being wise. And then we insert, of course, what we think the fruit of wisdom is going to be, job security or, whatever we insert from our particular culture. But then it continues in verse 24. Because I called, remember it's wisdom calling out, and you refused, I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention. You neglected all my counsel and did not want my reproof. I will also laugh at your calamity, and I will mock when your dread comes. When your dread comes like a storm and your calamity comes like a whirlwind, when your distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge, and they did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would not accept my counsel. They spurned all my reproof. So they will eat the fruit of their own way and be satiated with their own devices. For the waywardness of the naive will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But the one who listens to me will live securely and will be at ease from the dread of evil. So, you'll notice that transition to all the apocalyptic imagery. It's imagery that becomes really prominent in apocalyptic literature, right? There's a whirlwind and a storm, distress, anguish, calamity. So the whole framing of the introduction of the book of Proverbs is that you ought to listen and treasure wisdom because it gives you the fear of God before a day of calamity.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of how the whole thing is structured. And so you can definitely see how apocalypticism would pick up on this. Apocalyptic writers later would pick up on these two paths. The one that listens to wisdom and in the time of calamity, through the time of calamity, is at ease from the dread of evil, and the one who doesn't choose the fear of God, which is the voice of wisdom. And they experience the distress, anguish, calamity, and dread of the whirlwind that the Lord sends. So it's a lot more apocalyptic sounding than you might think when you think of reading a proverb a day. But you can see how this is going to go later on. where there's a clear delineation between the righteous and the wicked and their future based on how they live right now and how eventually it will lead. In a lot of passages in Proverbs, there is sort of like a hint that it's not just going to go on forever. There is going to be a final judgment. There's going to be a final recompense, and God actually giving justice and what's owed to each one after the day of judgment. So anyways, that's there's a lot more of that in context to the book of Proverbs than we might think.
And I think, Proverbs really plays into the exhortation to get wisdom. I mean, that's the whole introduction, is wisdom calling out. Yeah, right. In chapter 2, wisdom is saying, seek wisdom more than silver. Verse 4, search for it as hidden treasure. Then you'll understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. And then chapter 3, it says, get wisdom, get insight, do not forsake, don't turn away, do not forsake her wisdom, she will keep you, love her, she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is to get wisdom, and whatever you get insight. And so this kind of drive that is instilled for the gaining of wisdom and insight. And then, for example, in Daniel, which is a real impetus toward the apocalyptic tradition, the two are merged together, where the prophetic insight is kind of born out of the desire for wisdom. And so, in chapter 1 in Daniel, as for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. Daniel had understanding in all dreams and visions. And so it's the desire for wisdom and understanding of God and history and his sovereignty and the covenant that then produces the visions of eschatology and the future, the extrapolating of the prophetic tradition is, the impetus for it. The catalyst is the emphasis on wisdom and knowledge from God. And so then in, chapter 2, for example, when Daniel receives the first big vision that he receives, he responds and says, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times as seasons. He removes kings and sets them up. So it's the emphasis on sovereignty. Yeah, he gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what's in darkness, and light dwells with him. And so the sovereignty of God applied to human history with wisdom produces the eschatological vision. And you see the same kind of interplay between the wisdom tradition and the prophetic tradition play out, for example, in First Enoch and Second Baruch, where they are kind of portrayed as wisdom seers. They are given unique revelations of wisdom and understanding from God, but particularly Fourth Ezra. And so Fourth Ezra, the 7 visions that are given to Ezra come out of this desire of Ezra to know and understand God and redemptive history, and particularly the suffering of the righteous, which is one of the main themes in Proverbs, the suffering of the righteous, the prosperity of the wicked. So in Fourth Ezra, which begins in chapter 3, Ezra is praying to God, and then the angel Uriel appears to him and basically explains to him gives him the answers to Ezra's prayers concerning the suffering of the righteous. And he says in chapter 4, he gives him kind of a Job response in verses 7 and following. And he says, he said to me, verse 10, you cannot understand the things with which you have grown up. How then can you understand, your mind comprehend the way of the Most High? And how can one who is already worn out by the corrupt world understand incorruption? When I heard this, I fell on my face and said, it would be better for us not to be here than to come here and live in ungodliness and to suffer and not understand why. And so the whole dynamic around 4th Ezra is that Ezra is in Babylon and he can't understand the suffering of the righteous, the prosperity of the wicked. He cries out to God. God sends an answer for Ezra to understand why all of this is happening. And the answer is the eschatological visions. So, for example, in Ezra in chapter 4, Ezra responds to the eschatological vision, the first one, and says, I beseech you, my Lord, why have I been endowed with the power of understanding? For I did not wish to inquire about the ways above, but about those things which we daily experience, which is kind of the Proverbs, just kind of daily, the paths of the righteous and the wicked and how that play out. And he says, why Israel has been given over to the Gentiles as a reproach, why the people whom you love have been given to godless tribes, and the law of our fathers has been made to no effect, and the written covenants no longer exist. And why we pass from the world like locusts, our lives are like a mist, and why we're not worthy to obtain mystery. And so then the angel responds and says, if you are alive, you will see, and if you live long, you will often marvel, because the age is hastening swiftly to its end. For it will not be able to bring the things that have been promised to the righteous in their appointed times, because this age is full of sadness and infirmities. For the evil about which you ask me has been shown, but the harvest of it has not yet come. If therefore that which has been sown is not reaped, we'll conclude with verse 27. For it will not be able to bring the things that have been promised to the righteous to their appointed times, because this age is full of sadness and infirmities. So the answer of the angel is that this age is full of sadness and infirmity. It can't be fixed, and the sovereignty of God can't be resolved in the issue of the righteous and the wicked in this age. It has to be completed swiftly to the end. And the end is the way that you cope. The end is the discipleship mechanism by which you cope and deal with the oppression of the wicked, the unfulfilled promises of the covenant and the future. And so 4th Ezra is a great example. And then the eschatological visions that play out in 4th Ezra is the way that wisdom tradition and prophetic tradition kind of play together, being pushed to its ultimate end.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really important to see that, John, because I think even now, as we begin to look at the book of Job, we're going to see something real similar with the interplay between divine sovereignty and the suffering of the righteous. But let's just wrap up today's episode, guys, with a quick look at Job here. I think by way of introduction, or just by way of a summary of the book, you get a little bit of the introduction of who Job is and his situation and what's happening in the first couple of chapters. And then obviously things go really downhill for him. I mean, Job's a pretty well read and maybe not so much well understood, but well read book. And people read Job a lot and go, oh man, well, God's going back and forth with Job. Job's got a bunch of friends, and his friends say, well, you're suffering and bad stuff happened to you because of this. And then another friend comes and says, well, no, it's actually because of this. And Job's just like, man, I don't know what to think. This is crazy, because this is really strange. Like, a lot of the wrangling of the book is around divine sovereignty and divine justice, and kind of this constant churning of, well, is God just? I mean, does he reward and does he punish? I mean, but what's the deal? I'm righteous, Job is saying. So is God punishing me? And the book will conclude really with some going back and forth between God and Job, and then Job eventually repenting. But God basically says, I'm sovereign and I'm ruling over this and I can do what I want. And Job says, okay, you do what you want. And I realize things don't really play out in this age like the way they should. So the book kind of concludes there. And then, it kind of begs for the apocalyptic writers and apocalyptic themes to be drawn from it because of this interplay between the righteous and the wicked, and the suffering of the righteous, and what's the deal with Job.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think John's reference to, he read that last little part of 4 Ezra chapter 4, that becomes really helpful, because you realize, like, that is on one hand, that is kind of that's the conclusion to the book of Job, is that this age is not only not adequate for God's justice to be vindicated in terms of the recompense for the righteous and the wicked, but this age is not sufficient. It's inadequate to actually have an actual to have an appropriate expression of where God's sovereignty is going. So even though God's sovereignty has set things up in this way, that's not where it's going to stand forever. And so I think you have a lot of this discussed in Job. And like you talked about the, kind of the debate with his friends and kind of the various arguments. Job is a little bit odd to me. It's a little bit like Song of Solomon and Jonah and a couple others where there's not explicit reference to the covenant. And so you gotta wonder, like, what is going on here? And my personal take is that, that like, kind of like I hinted about Jonah, a few weeks ago, that I think, so even the name Yov in Hebrew, Yov is most likely derived from the Akkadian, and which means despised or afflicted one. And I think in some ways Job may actually be a stand-in for the people of Israel and their history, but that's kind of another matter. We won't read that back into the book. But that said, he's framed as a despised or afflicted one. That's actually what his name means. And so the point is to illustrate theodicy and how the righteous are suffering. And the conclusion of the book is that wisdom triumphs, because the whole debate is why is righteous Job suffering? And the debate with his friends is a back and forth about how to frame the world and how it functions in context to God's sovereignty, or in context to what we call theodicy, which is resolving the problem of evil with a righteous and just God. So the last two chapters of the book really expose the folly of, on one hand, Job, but real specifically Job's friends and their way of viewing what's going on with Job. Because like Josh was saying, their arguments are essentially responding to divine sovereignty. They're basically arguing that divine sovereignty and the divine will should always have a full expression in the present age. And so, like, Job, something's wrong, man. Like, right. I must be a lot more righteous than you because God's not doing to me what he's doing to you. So you need to just search your heart a little bit more, bro. And so this is kind of the wisdom of their friends, is they assume that recompense and that the justice of God is always being meted out in this age.
Yep.
And this is what gets overturned, like at the start of chapter 42, where the Lord says, I'm very angry with your friends. They have not spoken what is right. You need to set your friends straight because I'm not pleased with what they've said. But this is kind of how it goes. And then the wisdom that gets vindicated at the end is God revealing creation to Job, essentially, and his sovereignty over creation, and then saying that's all you need to know to respond correctly and humbly when these things happen, Job. And so this becomes the answer, and then Job humbles himself, and God vindicates him after this response.
Yeah, and I think that's really the punchline of Job, is that the book ends with the question of the suffering of the righteous, which I agree, Bill. Like, why is the book included when there's no reference to Israel or the covenant?
Right.
Why would it be canonized, after the exile, other than it is an individual representation of Israel's suffering? So I totally agree. But in the book itself, it's a question of the suffering of the righteous and an explanation of it. And the punchline of the book of Job is that divine sovereignty expressed in creation is the justification.
Yep.
Yeah.
And as much explanation as you have. The apocalyptic tradition shifts that and says the punchline, is that divine sovereignty expressed in eschatology is the justification and explanation. Of course, the two are tied together, that eschatology is a restoration of creation or protology, but Job just really has creation as the expression of divine sovereignty, as the justification. And it's left there hanging. It doesn't really answer like what it's unto, but and that's why the book is just awkward, because there's no the punchline doesn't really scratch the itch. I mean, I don't want to be blasphemous or whatever, but it doesn't, like, you finish Job and it's just kind of like, oh, because I am. And that's why Job went through all that suffering. There's no language of the two ages to really kind of give context or answer, which then, the apocalyptic tradition really adds that in.
Especially in the conclusion, it's not. It doesn't find it satisfactory. I was looking earlier at the Septuagint of Job, and in the conclusion in the Hebrew text, it reads in chapter 42, verse 17, "And Job died an old man full of days," and it just kind of concludes there. But like you said, John, it doesn't make everything okay. It just it's kind of a cliffhanger. And so the Septuagint translator adds this phrase. So, "And Job died an old man and full of days, and as it is written, he will rise again with those whom the Lord raises up." And so they assume that this is like the logical conclusion of where it's going, is that Job as a righteous man will be raised, and so it will have the proper ending, so to speak, that it's lacking in the Hebrew text.
Right.
Another famous one in another well-cited passage, because of I know my Redeemer lives, and on the last I will, my eyes will see him and everything. In Job 19, verse 26 makes a reference to his skin being destroyed in the Septuagint. Not only says destroyed, but then says, "and his skin will be raised," also inserting their concepts of the resurrection. Job 14, also in the Septuagint, has an interesting interpretation. "For if a man should die, he will live, having accomplished the days of his life." So if a man should die, he will yet live, having accomplished the days of his life. "I will wait until I exist again," is what Job says there. I will wait till I exist again. So there's a lot of that kind of cliffhanger element of Job gets reconciled a lot in apocalyptic literature, and here just in the Septuagint.
Yeah, I mean that's even the Septuagint, right? Like that. This isn't necessarily like after the time of Jesus or anything. This is a couple hundred years before the time of Jesus, which just goes to show you what they were thinking about related to these apocalyptic themes.
Yeah, because that really is, like John said, it's the punchline of Job, is that divine sovereignty is not adequately carried out in this age because of the issue of God's justice and God's love. And so it doesn't have a proper conclusion. And so to project that conclusion into the future, I mean, this is what apocalyptic literature is. You project the conclusion into the future. And so we shouldn't be surprised if people saw this in Job and felt the need to fill in the blanks.
Yeah, and there's a whole book called The Testament of Job, which is basically a recapitulation of the book of Job. It's late Second Temple period, sometime, 1st century BC, 1st century AD, but in that time, before the destruction of the temple. And you really have kind of the eschatological piece added. And the emphasis in the Testament of Job is on Job's patience in light of the eschatological conclusion, which I think, you get that same language in the Testament of Job is picked up in the New Testament, like in James 5, where James exhorts, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. Establish your hearts, the coming of the Lord's at hand." He says, as an example, verse 10, James 5:10, "As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." And so the apocalyptic tradition and the New Testament views Job in light of his eschatological conclusion. And the purpose is, again, for discipleship, to view your life in relation to divine sovereignty and how that's going to conclude in the end at the day of the Lord and in the judgment.
Yeah. Amen. Well, great stuff, guys. We definitely have much more to say about the wisdom tradition, about books in the Ketuvim, in the Tanakh, but especially next week, we want to dive into the book of Psalms with David Mitchell. As we've mentioned before, David sets forth what he calls an eschatological program, and he sees the redaction of the Psalms as laying forth overview of and a projecting forward of Israel's eschatology as developed even in the prophets, and then later on in apocalyptic tradition. So we're going to get into that with David Mitchell next week. And until then, we hope this has been beneficial and encouraging to you. And join us again next time. So thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. God bless and Maranatha.
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 Thanks for listening to the Apocalyptic Gospel Podcast. For more, visit us on our website at apocalypticgospel.com and follow us on Twitter at Apocalyptic Gospel.